200 years ago, we were living in a world of scarcity, and now we're living in a world of abundance. How does that affect the way we have to live today? I mean, now we've got too much food, too much media, like too much everything. And now, so what does that mean?
I think we live in a very interesting time, and I think a lot of what we're experiencing as political polarization, a lot of public frustration at social media and tech companies and corruption and all this stuff. I think a lot of that is at its root that for most of human history, it was all about more. If you learned more than the next guy, you would have an advantage. If you were able to do more or have more opportunities, that's what got you ahead. I think today that's reversed. I think today what gets you ahead is knowing how to focus on less, knowing how to cut through the bullshit, knowing how to ignore, like, okay, those opinions aren't valid or aren't helpful. That's probably not true. These are the two things I should focus on. Like, it's very few people have that skill right now. And I feel like that's the skill that's going to get you ahead right now. Because one of the things I've been talking about on my tour is I think there's a lot to be said that I think the human mind has a bandwidth limit. There's only a certain amount of information we can process. And once you exceed that bandwidth limit, our minds start taking shortcuts. And those shortcuts basically look like prejudice, stereotypes, bigotry, irrational beliefs, narcissism. And so if you're consuming too much stuff and it's not nutritious information, your brain's going to start taking all these shortcuts, and it's going to make you worse off. And so I think the real challenge today is about finding those, find the 20% that produces the 80 result, or the 20% that represents 80% of what's actually going on.
And that's the subtle art of not giving a fuck about most things and choosing the things to give a fuck about.
Yes. Find the handful, find the handful of people that truly matter and really cultivate those relationships. Find the handful of causes or issues that really matter and focus all your energy on them, and find the few amounts of information sources or media that is really, really helpful and beneficial for both you and the world, and then just cut out all the bullshit.
And find the few values that are important to you and the few metrics that are important to you, and focus on those, and don't focus on the hundreds out there that you can always find someone on Instagram that's better at you than all of those. And that's hard.
I think one of the jokes I make in Subtle Art is I said, like, I don't care how good you are at something, there's an 11-year-old on YouTube who's better. Like, that's just the world we live in, So it's hard to really take pride. And I mean, this kind of gets into what I talk about in the second book, which is like, back in the day, we kind of lived in these smaller communities. We didn't have a lot of communication with, we didn't know what people in New York and London were doing. It's like we had our little neighborhood and our little city. And so if you were like the guitar player in your town, like, that was your identity. That's where you got meaning. That's how you were validated, what a lot of your relationships were based on. And I think being exposed to everything, and now you go online and there's some 8-year-old who's better than you, it kind of robs us of those identities and those sources of meaning for ourselves. And it's the unseen negative side effect of being globally aware.
Yeah. Because it's weird, because in one way, YouTube and Instagram, like, for example, I know I have a lot of people come on here that are into physical movement, and the fact, I have a hand balancing teacher who does one-arm handstands. I mean, the fact is, now you can see so many people doing these physical movements that 10 years, 20 years ago, you thought were nearly impossible.
Yeah.
And by seeing that they're possible, everyone does them all.
Yeah.
So like the learning curve is just climbing of just human possibilities of movement. And that's one of the great things of globalization, maybe, because learning's happening fast and people are super inspired by people pushing the envelope. But then the downside is that now you're constantly comparing yourself with all of these people.
Yes.
And the bandwidth, the Dunbar number, like none of that stuff
Yeah.
is what we're used to.
Well, it's a multifaceted paradox because, as you pointed out, the technology has large informational and material advantages, but there are emotional disadvantages. And that's kind of what the new book is about. Is that there's something about, even though we are smarter, safer, healthier, better off in most ways than we were 20, 30 years ago, emotionally we are desperately clawing for a sense of meaning or a sense of hope. Mental illnesses are rising in most developed places in the world. Pessimism is at all-time highs. Polarization issues. People like loneliness is a huge issue. So there's a weird asymmetry that comes with a lot of this technology. Like the same way we benefit from learning all this amazing stuff on YouTube, there's it destroys our sense of community. It removes, it makes it more difficult to kind of satiate ourselves emotionally than, it used to be. It's like if you wanted to go learn something, like you went, sat in a room with 20 people and took a class, and like that built a sense of community, sense of purpose. You developed relationships. Everything feels very meaningful. It's like you can learn all this you can go online and learn all this great stuff and be smarter than you ever would have been otherwise, but you're isolated.
Yeah.
And there's millions of other people doing it too, so it doesn't feel meaningful. There's nothing validating you in particular for it. And so it all starts to feel a little bit pointless at a certain point.
And you think that is the root of a lot of this division and tribalism? Do you think it's just as these human animal and maybe as a global species that when this stuff starts happening up here that it has deep-seated like problems and we start lashing out, like you said?
Yeah.
Paradox of choice, where too many decision fatigue, and then you start becoming, like you said, bigoted or racist or these kinds of things.
Because that literally is your mind trying to take a shortcut.
Right.
It's like when everything you do, you have hundreds of options. It's just overwhelming and it's fatiguing, And so at some point you have to start developing principles or heuristics to kind of narrow down your selections of like what you're going to pursue or spend your time on or pay attention to. And so, when people fall into prejudice and bigotry, like that is what their mind is doing. Is they're like, well, you know what? We've got 100 options, but this is way too hard. So let's just decide that these 60 are bad,
right,
no matter what. Because then at least that makes the load becomes easier on our minds. I personally think, having spent the last few years researching this, I really think social isolation and loneliness is kind of the root cause of a lot of what we're experiencing as like a post-truth world or political polarization or just people being upset. Like I think the fact that it's so much harder to get out of the house, have meaningful face-to-face relationships, and even have those face-to-face relationships where both people are present. They're not on their phones. They're not like texting or whatever. Have that kind of awkward, uncomfortable interaction that ultimately generates that sense of meaning and identity and purpose. I think the lack of that, the way that we emotionally compensate for it, is going online and just being idiots.
And hating on people. I think you're right. I think you're right, man. And it probably is going to get worse before it gets better, because what you talk about in the second book especially is taking personal responsibility and going in and, taking ownership of all these things. And that's a hard thing to learn how to do. And I feel like it's going to take time.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm pessimistic in the short term. I'm optimistic in the long term.
Okay.
I agree. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think, the big argument in the second book about hope is that ultimately it's we all need some hope. We need hope to kind of function well psychologically. And the more we struggle with meaning or purpose in our lives, the more hope we look for to kind of compensate for that. But the point I make in the book is that when you when you're putting all of the meaning in your life into your hopes, when you, like, let's say everything you live for is the hope that, you know, some policy will pass in your country, or that you'll get your dream job or whatever, what you do is you make yourself very vulnerable to just like an existential crisis. Because when things don't go your way, when life hands your ass to you, when something unexpected pops up, if all of your hopes are in that one basket and that basket gets yanked away, like you're lost. You're just completely lost. And so the book is all about how we need to be very careful of what we hope for, because it's kind of this blind faith in our hopes, and just constantly doubling down on our hopes that actually causes all these problems in the first place. You know, we need to hold our hopes lightly, be skeptical of them.
Yeah. I had Jordan Peterson in here, and he says we shouldn't pursue happiness. We should pursue meaning.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's what you talk about.
Yeah, it's funny. I agree. So like the psychology side of what he talks about, like I totally on the same page, and I think a lot of his we're both experiencing a lot of popularity because I think we're two of the only people in this space that are talking about that it's like, no, you need struggle, you need challenge. And besides, there's no such thing as a life without struggle or challenge. So like, get used to it. So you might as well find something meaningful to struggle for. Like that is your job. That's the ultimate responsibility of like being kind of a grown, functioning human.
I had an AI guy in here last week, Dr. Ben Gertzel, runs a company called Singularity Net, really smart guy. And
Yeah.
he's like, well, Brian, we're gonna upload our consciousness to the cloud, and then we're not gonna have any problems. And okay, I've been hanging out with Jordan Peterson and reading your books, and I'm like, but we need struggle to have identity as humans. And he's like, what are you talking about, Brian? No, we don't. Like, you're just gonna be up there in some cloud dream, being a superhero, wherever you want to be, and that'll be the next evolution of human consciousness. We don't have to worry about problems. And part of me just thought, that's crazy. But then part of me thought, maybe I should listen to what he says. Maybe this is the ultimate evolution of human beings. But I always think that we will have problems.
Well, he should read the last chapter of the new book, because I talk about AI. And basically what I say is that if we do end up with a cloud consciousness, there will be tribal civil wars programmed into the cloud so that we all feel that we have something meaningful to fight for as we're in the cloud, like I don't know, maybe he probably knows way better than I do, but like the argument that I make is that it's, again, this is a fundamental function of our psychology, like that we evolved this for a very specific, we evolved to have tribal fights and like hopes for some kind of utopian future. Like this is what got us here. The problem is that now our technology is advanced to such a point that I make the argument that, we're not mature enough to kind of deal with it. It's like handing a bazooka to a 4-year-old. You just like really hope he doesn't press the trigger. Like that we're very quickly arriving at that point as a culture, as a species. And so my hope, and I use that word very deliberately, is my hope is that the technology, the AI advances far enough to kind of pull the gun away from the baby and be like, let me show you how to use this responsibly, or maybe just keep it away from us entirely.
Right, otherwise it could just escalate to these really big problems.
Yeah,
it'll be interesting to see what happens there. You mentioned about having people are really lonely these days, and I get it, even though we're connected. And I think that's why, honestly, things like this, these long-form discussions where you get to have a real conversation. We were talking about Eddie Hall earlier, the world's strongest man, and I had a 2-hour conversation with him where he really got emotional about like his mom and his grandma. She died on her deathbed, and he promised her that he would do this thing. And I think people spend 2 hours with him and they're like, wow, I feel like I spent time with a human and I'm connected again, as opposed to the Instagram feed or the Facebook thing and the memes and the where I don't feel connected. So it's weird in the fact that I think that's why long form is interesting to people, because they feel that human connection again. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I absolutely. I think about this a lot because it's, I've blogged for 11 years now. And I remember early in my career, so I've always written very long articles, 20, 30-page articles. And early in my career, people are always like, man, you got to write shorter articles, man. Like, people don't have the attention span. And I'm like, it's funny because the longer the articles get, the more successful they are. You know, like the more they get shared. And I think that is an effect of it is again, it's kind of when you present people with long form content. And again, this is assuming it's really good and engaging. But like when you present people with long form content, you're helping them cut out all that noise and distraction that we were talking about earlier, where you're helping them only give a fuck about something that seems like very important, you know, because it's like I could spend 3 hours on YouTube watching like 40 different videos, and some of them will be good, some will be bad, but the whole time I'm having to like make decisions and figure out, is this worth watching? Or like, no, I don't really like that, go back to this one, whatever. Or I could put on a video like this and just know, it's like, all right, you know, next 2 hours, like I'm set. And it's like, there's something relieving about that, that people like.
Yeah, very much so.